The crash of metal trays silenced the ward. Who touched the donor log? Margaret's voice shook, sharp enough to cut the air. Sarah froze, the papers still warm in her hand. Down the hall, Daniel's monitor screamed into chaos. Security boots pounded closer, echoing like judgment. In that instant, everyone knew. Someone had betrayed the rules of survival. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Rain had been falling on St. Michael's ward for 3 days, a steady, patient drizzle that washed the hospital windows until the world beyond them smudged into watercolor. Fluorescent lights hummed in the corridors, their cool, white glow making the wet linoleum gleam like a glass table. The smell of disinfectant lived under everything. Coffee, old books, the faint animal tang of antiseptic on a nurse's sleeve. Outside, the city breathed in a gray, practiced sigh. Inside, the ward kept its small, stubborn life. Sarah moved through that life like someone who had learned to carry her own weather. She wore her hair pulled back, practical, and even a little severe, and the name badge on her chest read Sarah Collins in block letters. Her uniform was the pale blue of hospital dawns, and her shoes were the soft, worn kind that remembered every shift. She pushed the medication cart with one hand and held a paper cup of coffee in the other, careful not to spill. The cup shivered with steam and hope. She stopped at room 217 because Daniel was awake, and Daniel's smile was a thin, private thing that came when he allowed it. He had fought in a war that seemed older than the hospital's plaster, lines on his face like ridges carved by wind. But his eyes kept a humor that surprised people. He had been moved to St. Michael's after a fall. The team suspected a slow bleed, a ghost bruise behind the skull. He was 82, stubborn as a locked gate, and he told stories in fragments that made nurses linger. "Morning, Daniel," Sarah said. Her voice had a softness that had nothing to do with timidity. It was the voice of someone who had learned to speak around pain. He looked at her like he recognized the world through her. "Morning, Sarah. Coffee smells nice." She set the cup on the bedside table. "Only the good stuff today?" He reached for it with fingers like thin ropes. "You look tired." "I am," she admitted. "You too." Daniel laughed, a small sound like someone finding a coin in an old coat. "Tired makes us honest." Honesty was a thing Sarah had learned to prize because it kept the day's illusions from taking up space. The ward asked for honesty in small measures. A drip adjusted, a lie withheld for kindness, a truth said bluntly when a family needed it. Sarah had given all she had, skill, hours, patience, and still felt uneasy, as if friction had been building somewhere she couldn't see. The hospital had been cutting budgets for months. New machines arrived late. Staff shifts were sliced thin. Rumors moved faster than memos. Layoffs, reassignments, a board meeting that might rearrange entire departments. Sarah had stayed because the job itself tightened something in her, a sense of doing right that made the world smaller and clearer. Her mother used to say she had the stubbornness of their grandmother. Once Sarah set her hands to something, she did not let it go. That morning, a clipboard in her hand carried more than charts. On top of Daniel's file, someone had written a note in thick blue ink. "Hold. Consult." The handwriting had the brisk calm of a physician who feared paperwork more than consequences. Sarah read it 3 times, as if the repetition would make the instruction another color. She checked his vitals. The monitor hummed an anxious song. Heart steady but high. Oxygen levels dip, blood pressure a slow drum. The wound behind his ear, tiny, almost secret, gave off nothing that machines could prize. But the bleed had come from a place where the body kept its private dangers. Sarah had seen the signs before, enough times to know when silence was a hazard. A junior doctor rounded in, a quick step and quick smile. "Morning, Sarah. How's Mr. Mercer?" "Daniel," she corrected without looking up. The doctor blinked, then smiled shyly. "Morning, Daniel. His scans." "Hold," Sarah said. "Look at his medication list." He's on low-dose anticoagulants at home. He's a veteran, cardiac history. His son mentioned a fall 3 days ago. The doctor glanced at the note at the monitor at Sarah. The training in his eyes was new and clean. It had not yet learned what older shifts taught by accident. We have the scans coming. Neurosurgery will. Sarah felt a thin heat rise in her chest. The ward moved in patterns that could smother, if not tended. We should not wait, she said. If he's on anticoagulants and there's any suspicion of hemorrhage, watching for 12 hours is a risk. He needs observation in a higher setting or you'll have to discuss with charge, the doctor said, the phrase acting like a shield. Charge nurse Margaret passed in the doorway like someone who carried a dozen small storms. Margaret's hands were precise, her face a map of days on call. We're following the protocol, she said. Her voice was a measured instrument. If neuro says hold, we hold. If they escalate, we escalate. We don't move patients without orders. Sarah looked at Margaret and then at Daniel. Protocols existed because people had been hurt by improvisation. Protocols saved many. They also sometimes let an old man wait while blood mapped a new damage. Something in Sarah tightened like a fist. She did what nurses did when rules felt like walls. She bent the rules in service of a better angle, not in rebellion, but in the quiet of responsibility. She marked his chart with an additional observation. Increased neurological checks at 30-minute intervals, a note to monitor pupil response, a separate line that read, family contacted, son aware. She placed a call to radiology again and wrote the time, precise as a small prayer. When the junior doctor left, murmuring about running the request, Margaret watched Sarah for a long heartbeat, then nodded once. I'll cover the notes, she said. You're on the floor, Sarah. Keep him stable. Sarah kept him stable by a method of small attention, adjusting pillows so his head sat at the right angle, keeping the light soft, speaking to him about small things, the way clouds looked that morning, a football game from a past decade. He answered with fragments, a name, a city, the taste of bread. When a nurse walks the edge of an old life, those fragments can be more real than any chart. At 10 o'clock, the son arrived. His name was Michael Mercer, and he had his father's eyes and a city lawyer's impatience. He patted Daniel's hand like someone trying to anchor himself. What's going on, he asked. He spoke with the certainty of a man used to calling and receiving answers as if by right. Sarah took him into the small family room. She kept her words direct because people needed clarity more than comfort at first. Your father was brought in after fall. He's on anticoagulants. We have a small bleed that needs careful watching. We've ordered a CT to be sure. Michael's face folded. How soon? We've pushed radiology, Sarah said. They're moving the request up. We're performing regular neurological checks. If we see any changes, we'll escalate immediately. Michael looked at her as if measuring whether she would keep her promises. He nodded like someone taking a note in his head. Keep me posted, he said. Call my cell. She wrote down his number and placed it on the chart. Small formalities stacked like stones against a rising tide. When she walked back to Daniel's bedside, she found him staring at the window as the rain dimmed outside. You did good, he said. She sat and took his hand. We're watching, she replied. The truth in the ward was that watching sometimes was victory enough. The day would stretch, a thin rope to be walked. Somewhere beyond the ward, the hospital's administration hummed with other calculations. Budgets, meetings, memos. Decisions rested on signatures and lines on spreadsheets. And yet, in this room, for this man, Sarah's small actions stood between a chart and a life. She felt the weight of that split. It made her breath slow and steady, like fingers pressed to the lip of a wound to check for bleeding. She had reasons to be afraid. Loss that had not yet been named, a ledger of nights when care had been the only thing that kept her from stumbling. She had reasons to be brave. The difference between them was not always clear in the light. The corridor clock clicked toward noon. A nurse called out over the gentle noise of trolleys. CT's next. Room 217. Sarah's hands moved with habitual certainty. She helped secure Daniel for the scan, smoothing blankets, speaking to him in small sentences that were meant to steady. He squeezed her hand when they wheeled him away, a small, private anchor. When the doors closed behind the scanner, Sarah stood in the empty hall and watched the rain trace new patterns on the window. She felt the particular ache of doing the right thing in a place that measured rightness in boxes and hours and signatures. She could not see the rest of the hour. She could only see the immediate, and in that immediate she found the place she had chosen to stand. The CT room smelled of warm plastic and cold metal. The scanner made a soft owl cry as it began its circuit, and Sarah watched the grain of light on the ceiling as if reading a map. The images would tell the truth in black and white. They would show whether the small bruise behind Daniel's ear had turned into something dangerous. She felt the patient's pulse in her palm on the stretcher handle, a steady, stubborn rhythm that seemed to argue with the soft alarms. When the radiologist stepped from a control booth, his face was a mask of professional distance. He did not linger over pleasantries. "There is an intracranial bleed," he said, "small but active. We need a neurosurgical review." The words landed like cold stones. Sarah's chest tightened. Active bleed meant movement, change, time tipping. Back on the ward, the monitor watched Daniel as if waiting for him to tell a secret. The neurosurgery team moved cautiously. Their consultation came with the language of caution: hold, observe, recheck in 2 hours. They recommended reversal only if the bleed expanded. Protocols hung between Sarah and the clear thing she felt in her hands: that a man on anticoagulants who had a fall could slide from small to fatal in minutes. She walked the thin line nurses walk, between being thorough and being stalled. She called neurosurgery again and left messages that smelled faintly of insistence. The junior doctor promised to chase it, then promised again. Hours folded into each other like paper, and the watch on her wrist became an index of worry. At 4:30, Daniel's pupils narrowed unevenly. His speech slurred. The monitor put out a small, insistent beep. Sarah moved before the alarms could become slogans. She pressed the call bell for the doctor and began the protocol she could perform without an order. Increased neurological checks to every 5 minutes, head elevation, oxygen, and a direct call to the on-call registrar. Her hands did what they had to do: fast, practice, calm. The registrar arrived with the authority of someone used to mediating risk. He leaned in and looked at the chart and at Daniel and at Sarah. His voice folded the ward into a single timeline. "We can't reverse without an order," he said. "We follow protocol." "You said earlier to escalate if there were changes," Sarah replied. "He's showing neurological decline. If the bleed expands another centimeter, we'll lose the window to reverse cleanly." He hesitated, the kind of pause that is not empty but counting consequences. "Get me a bed in HDU if you can. Keep checking. I'll call neurosurgery again." They called neurosurgery. The reply arrived in the brittle language of policy: hold, observe. The neurosurgeon insisted on waiting for his team to come in from their other cases. Time narrowed down to a single thread of waiting. Sarah felt the thread vibrate in her palm. She thought of the long list of things that could be done now to tilt the odds: reversal agents, clotting factors, a quick intervention that sometimes made the difference between a life that continued and a life that ended. None of it belonged to her alone to decide. None of it fit the boxes that hospital lawyers like to scrutinize. Margaret stood near the doorway, arms folded. Sarah could read the map of her face: loyalty to the system, fear of the phone call that might come from administration. The ward's walls had plaques and donor names. One plaque in the reception bore the name of a retired general and a foundation that funded a wing of the hospital. The hospital did not need chaos. Donors disliked chaos. Margaret's eyes, for a single breath, looked away from Daniel to the plaque and then back again. Sarah felt the shift like a soft wind. When Daniel's breathing grew shallow and the nurse charted a drop in responsiveness, the registrar finally moved. He ordered a bolus of reversal medication, urgent vitamin K, and plasma. The ward exhaled, but the pharmacy called back. A machine had been marked for inventory. The hospital had low stock that day. The delay was a small, bureaucratic thing that felt huge. They could wait for the plasma from the blood bank or give a prothrombin complex concentrate that would work faster, but required a consultant sign-off. No one wanted to give over the phone. Sarah considered the steps and the distance between them. The decision sat like a weight. She thought of Daniel's hands, that tight smile, the way he trusted the people who stayed with him. She thought of small salvageable things that nurses were taught to hold. Dignity, a little time, sometimes a life. The registrar left to call the product through an exception. He said he would be back in minutes. 12 minutes is a strange measure. In some stories, it is a long time, in others, a breath. For Sarah, it was the length of a quiet war with the clocks. 10 minutes passed. Daniel's left-sided movement slowed. The oxygen tone dipped. Sarah tightened the strap of his oxygen mask and spoke to him. Short sentences, names of places he loved, fragments that might keep the mind tethered. At minute 11, the nurse in the next bay whispered that someone from risk management was on the phone asking about an incident report already filed. Sarah felt that whisper like a new, small wind in her hair. She blinked. An incident report? Before anything had been done? She walked to the nursing station, her shoes soft on the linoleum, and saw a printed page already in the inbox. At the top, bold and official, was the word, unauthorized medication administered. Sarah's hands went cold. Unauthorized. She had not given anything outside orders. She had been waiting for them. She had been calling them. She had been watching the man's pupils. She went back to Daniel's bed to find Margaret standing with a tablet, her face thin, as if carved. Margaret's fingers tapped the screen with a kind of ceremonial precision. "What is this?" Sarah asked. Margaret's mouth made a line. "An incident report. Someone noted medication was given without a proper order. Risk wants a statement. Administration has been notified." "No one gave anything," Sarah said. Her voice was steady but small. "We haven't had an order." On the monitor, a slow change marked itself like a bruise in time. The ward was filled with nurses' movements that had the nervous shape of people gathering for bad weather. The registrar returned, breathless, with the paperwork for the rapid reversal. He looked at the incident sheet on Margaret's tablet, and then at Sarah. For a bare second, his eyes betrayed a calculation, an arithmetic of inconvenience versus liability. "We'll sort this out," he said. "For now, stand down. Risk requires no one to touch anything until they review." The words dropped like ice. Sarah felt something in her chest split, part anger, part the hard, clinical ice of understanding that systems sometimes chose safety for themselves over safety for a patient. She thought of Daniel's life and of the way a ledger could outweigh a heartbeat on a sheet. Before she could protest further, 2 security officers arrived, faces expressionless. They did not carry accusations like a shout. They carried it like a badge. An administrator in a crisp suit followed them, his phone already out. He spoke quickly into it, words that Sarah could not place into meaning yet. Compliance, investigation, suspension pending review. Michael arrived at the door then, hair disheveled, cell pressed to his ear. His face folded in a way Sarah had not seen, a mix of fear and a defensive crispness. He looked from the registrar to Sarah to the incident report. "What is happening?" he demanded. Margaret stepped forward, tablet flat in her hands. "There's an allegation. Unauthorized administration of medication to your father. We have to follow policy." Michael's hand went to his pocket, the lawyer's instinct already forming. He asked for the incident report, his voice low and sharp. "I want his notes. I'll be filing." Sarah felt it. How quickly lines could be drawn. Michael's face hardened. She watched the son's instinct pivot from worry to defense, from anchor to instrument. The ward's light felt thinner, like a sheet pulled tight. They asked Sarah to step into the conference room. The security officers watched as if they guarded a small, fragile thing. The administrator read the paper on Margaret's tablet. The registrar offered a measured recounting of events. Margaret's voice was the same measured instrument that "You administered medication without order," the administrator said to Sarah. That is a serious breach. You are suspended pending investigation. Sarah's protest made no sound in the room full of paperwork and stern faces. She thought of Daniel in the bed, his hand limp now on the sheet. She thought of the minutes like small knives. The suspension paper was crisp in her hands. Her badge was taken at the desk with the same small ceremony. As security walked her out, she passed the donor plaque in reception, the retired general's name engraved in polished brass. Someone had donated money to the hospital in exchange for a wing named after rank and service. The name caught in her eye, and something cold ran down her spine. A thought that had not yet formed properly took shape at the edge of her mind, that some rules were not just about safety. Some decisions were made at a different table with different lights, and those decisions sometimes shimmered with motives that were not only medical. They led her down the back stairwell. Her shoes made a hollow sound on the concrete. The rain had stopped, and the sky outside was awash glass. She thought of Daniel breathing under monitors, of a sun at a doorway, of a ward that held both life and the kind of policy that could smother it. The world had shifted, and she did not yet know which way the shift would go. Sarah walked home with her badge heavy in her pocket and a silence that smelled like disinfectant still in her clothes. The city felt different from the inside of the hospital, louder, meaner, as if streets kept score. She lived in a small flat 2 blocks from the river, a place booked with little comforts, an old kettle, a faded armchair, photographs of a grandmother who had taught her to hold steady. She made tea without thinking. The kettles whistle a metronome for thoughts that would not sit still. At the heart of the confusion was a thin, acute worry. Had she done wrong, or had the hospital protected itself by finding someone to blame? The thought returned like a pulse. Sarah had never been reckless. Her decisions had always been practical, rooted in training and habit. That night she replayed the ward. The monitor's slow alarms, Daniel's narrowing pupils, the registrar's delay. She remembered the incident report, unauthorized medication, printed before any medication had been given. The paper felt like an accusation birthed from a different logic. Michael Mercer's face kept returning to her memory. The son's lawyerly air had slipped easily into a hard, defensive edge. He had watched the scene with the cold concentration of someone who thought about the consequences. Sarah wondered what he had seen and what he had chosen to see. In the family room, she had tried to be simple and exact. She had told him the facts. He had heard a threat. That gap between fact and meaning was where resentment started to grow. The next morning, Margaret called. Her voice was steady but threaded with something that could be read as pity or distance. "There's an inquiry," she said. "You're not to speak to staff or patients about it. HR will contact you." Sarah listened and did as she was told. Rules layered on rules. They felt like a net that caught her, one that could hold her up but might also drag her under. In the hours that followed, word moved through the hospital like a slow tide. Some nurses whispered her name with sympathy, others looked away as if the shadow of the incident was a contagion. Rumors are a kind of weather in hospitals. They change the mood without changing the facts. Daniel stayed unconscious for 2 days. He drifted between states as if suspended on a long rope. When Sarah learned about it through a mutual colleague, her throat tightened. She had been removed from his care, but the memory of his small smile and the way he liked his pillows at a certain angle clung to her. She went to the hospital and stood in the corridor, watching through a slatted glass door. Michael's presence there was larger now, steady as a bench. He spoke to consultants in low tones, his jaw set. The registrar moved like someone moving through prescribed steps. Margaret's eyes found Sarah across the glass and looked away quickly, a motion that felt like a betrayal to its own making. At home, Sarah began to think about the donor plaque she had passed when security walked her out. The plaque named a retired General Robert Whitfield and the foundation that had given a wing to St. Michael's. Donations were a visible thing. Brass, engraved, public. The influence was quieter. Sarah had not known until then how much a name could press on decisions. Funding for equipment, preferred access, even a line in an emergency protocol that favored discretion when certain names were involved. The idea put a coldness behind her ribs. She called an old friend from nursing school, Mark, who now worked in another hospital. He answered quietly and without judgment. "You need a record," he said. "All of it. Times, calls, chart entries. If there's an inquiry, you can show you did the work you were supposed to." Sarah opened Daniel's chart on the nurse's portal she still had access to and printed her notes from memory. Times she had called radiology when she increased neurological checks, the number she had written for Michael. She copied messages. She wrote down the registrar's replies word for word. The paper filled her hands like armor. It did not feel like proof against motive, but it felt like truth laid out. Michael's motives began to loom in a different light. He had the look of a son who would fight for the right thing, but Sarah sensed an urgency that spoke of reputation and control. She imagined him back at his office, drafting letters and thinking of legal life in neat paragraphs. Perhaps in his world, an allegation meant boxes to tick and a need to secure a position. Perhaps his quick pivot to litigation was a shield against loss. Empathy tightened her chest and then turned to a question. If he had leaned on the hospital, what did he want secured, a truth or a settlement? Then a twist arrived in the form of a casual remark from Dr. James Allen, a consultant who had once been kind to Sarah. He called to say he had heard the inquiry was not only about medication, but about who had access to the HDU that day. Some beds were reserved for a visiting delegation, he said, voice low. "You know how things are, VIP allocations. It complicates transfers. It's not usual, but it happens." Sarah felt that detail like a fresh bruise. "Reserved for whom?" she asked. "There's a team from a foundation visiting," James said. "They're connected to the General's foundation. The hospital wanted to show them the unit. It's small, but it complicates the flow." Complications had become a euphemism for decisions made at another table. The idea that a transfer could be delayed because a bed was being held felt like salt in an open wound. If HDU beds were reserved for visitors, then protocol had been bent in favor of optics. If that were true, then the delay in moving Daniel was not just a chain of small missteps, it was a choice with light on it. Sarah's anger was a quiet thing that refined her focus. She wanted to talk to Michael, to tell him what she had seen and done. She wanted to ask Margaret why the incident report had been filed before any medication. She wanted to confront the registrar about the delay, but the suspension was a legal cord. She kept to Mark's counsel and collected evidence. On the third day, Sarah met a woman named Helen Clark at a small cafe. Helen worked in the hospital's patient advocacy office and had the blunt kindness of someone who had listened to too many hard stories. "You did your job," Helen said, sliding a cup across the table. "But hospitals protect themselves. Sometimes they protect donors first. You need to be smart about how you push back. If there's a foundation involved, someone will try to bury the mess." "You think it's about the General?" Sarah asked. Helen nodded. "I don't know everything, but donor influence is real. Families who have money or position can move faster than patients who don't." The conversation planted a seed that would not stop growing. Sarah found herself watching the hospital from a different angle, as if behind every clinical decision there might be a ledger of gratitude and obligation. She began to see alliances where she had seen only co-workers, Margaret's steadiness, the registrar's carefulness, the way the boardroom had polished chairs and soft carpets that did not echo footsteps. Meanwhile, Daniel's condition stuttered in the way of fragile fires. He woke briefly with a clarity that made Sarah feel like she had not been suspended at all. He looked at her with a soft gratitude that was as casual as a blessing. "You came back," he said, voice croaked but steady. "Good. Keep the kettle near." She wanted to tell him about the plaque and the shirts and the threats, but words tasted too heavy. Instead, she smoothed his blanket and sat with him in silence. His breathing was shallow soap bubbles. He had no idea that his life was now a ledger entry and a test of wills. The subplot tightened around Michael, Margaret, and the registrar. Michael's legal calls became more frequent. Margaret's face grew harder, and she began to avoid Sarah's eyes altogether. The registrar, Dr. Allen, maneuvered between caution and protective maneuvers that made his loyalty unclear. Each of them had something to lose: reputations, stability, the favor of donors. Each of them had something to protect by silence. Sarah, suspended and watching, felt small and oddly combustible. She had been taught to hold life steady with hands that did not flinch. Now she had to hold a different thing, truth, against the pressure of systems that preferred neat, untroubled narratives. The stakes had shifted from a single bedside to the wider architecture that supported it. Betrayal, she realized, would not come with a shout. It would arrive on forms, in plaques, in the quiet of people looking the other way. Sarah had expected the world to move in small, explainable ways. A delay because of staffing, a form misplaced, a human error that could be fixed with a signature. She had not expected crooked light, decisions shaped by other people's favors, so when the first real proof slid into her hands, it felt like an unfair, bright thing. Helen called early with a voice that had lost its small softness. "I found something," she said. "Not from the patient files, from the admin calendar. Come in." The advocacy office smelled faintly of lemon and stale coffee. Helen pushed a printout across the table without preamble. It was a meeting invite, then a memo, then an email thread threaded like a thin, poisonous vine. Subject lines mentioned a delegation visit, an HDU tour, and a priority list. Names that had been abstract before. General Robert Whitfield, the Whitfield Foundation, Robert's aide, stood in black type. Margins carried times and short, sharp notes. Hold HDU. No interruptions. Prioritize VIPs. Sarah read with a slow, hardening quiet. The invitation was stamped 2 days before Daniel's fall. The memo from the director thanked Dr. James Allen for arranging access. The thread ended with an instruction so casual it felt brutal. If an incident occurs, ensure it is documented as clinical breach by staff. Risk will manage messaging. Sarah shut her eyes for a second and felt the room tilt. That line, document as clinical breach, was not protocol, it was a script. The script had been written before the event occurred. "How did you get this?" she asked. Her voice came out small. Helen shrugged, as if shrugging could erase the paper. Someone in admin slips things when they are worried about fallout. "I asked and someone answered. We're not supposed to have this, Sarah, but it's here." Sarah thought of Margaret tapping the tablet, the registrar's measured hesitations, Michael's lawyer's face. A new shape of betrayal resolved itself. Not a single hand acting, but a plan with names and stamps, a decision that had been made to hold a bed, and, if necessary, to sacrifice speed for optics. She asked Helen one thing she had no right to ask. Who put the clause about documenting staff breach? Helen passed another sheet across the table. It was a short email, and signed in its tone, polite in phrase, but raw in intent. Sent by the hospital's director of development to risk management and copied to Dr. Allen and Margaret's office. To ensure the delegation does not observe operational disruption, please advise risk that any deviation during their tour be handled as staff noncompliance. We must protect donor confidence. Sarah's hands tightened around the paper until the edges threatened to tear. Her training was an internal geography now, lines of what to do and when. Now another map overlapped that geography. The map of influence of donors and boardrooms, of donors' comfort outweighing a patient's immediate need. She stood up, the chair screeching like a small animal. "I need everything," she said. The line was not a question. It was a command she gave to herself. Helen pushed a flash drive across the table. "There's more. Access logs. Timestamps. But this is messy. You'll see who logged the HDU hold and who approved it. It's not just a line on a memo." Her eyes were tired in the way of people who watched institutions choose their own safety over others. At home, Sarah plugged the drive into the old laptop she kept for nights when she needed to organize facts. The access logs arranged themselves into a cold story. At 9:12, the HDU bed had been marked as reserved for the Whitfield delegation. The note carried the initials of Dr. James Allen. At 11:03, a staff member in administration updated the reservation to showcase priority. The admin user ID matched one that Margaret's office used for events. At 14:05, a risk officer placed a communication hold flag on incident reporting. A small bureaucratic control that meant no one could escalate without review. The order had been placed hours before Daniel's scan, hours before his decline. Sarah felt as if she were watching herself in a mirror that had been broken. The images fit together cleanly. The plaque she had seen, the reserved bed, the pre-written script about clinical breach. The betrayal was not a single act of cowardice, it was orchestration. People she had trusted, Dr. Allen, who had been kind, Margaret, who had always moved with the authority of steady hands, were part of the machinery that had chosen a delegation's comfort over immediate care. She went back to the hospital that afternoon with the printouts in an envelope like a small, dangerous thing. The ward's air smelled the same, disinfectant and coffee, and the thin, traded calm of people-used crisis. Margaret was on shift, her face lined and precise. Sarah found her at the nurse's station and walked up without ringing the old ways into motion. "Margaret," she said, feeling the word heavy and necessary. "I have something you need to see." Margaret's hand paused in the middle of a chart. Her eyes moved to the envelope, and then, for a second, away. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, voice flat. "Not alone," Sarah replied. She placed the prints on the counter, the emails and the access logs spread like evidence. "You put in the reservation. You were copied on the memo. Someone ordered the risk hold before my calls. Why did you sign off on holding HDU?" Margaret's face did not flush. Her hands folded as if she had been preparing them for this exact moment. "You think I made that decision alone?" she asked, and the question was the shape of a shield. "No," Sarah said, "but you participated. You tapped the tablet. You filed the incident report. Why?" Margaret's mouth made a line of granite. "We were told to preserve donor relations. The foundation was visiting. Dr. Allen and the director asked for cooperation. I signed a reservation for the unit. I did what I was told." The reply was not the denial Sarah expected. It was worse. The confession that duty had been redefined. "You filed the incident report before anything was done," Sarah said. "Who instructed you to do that?" Margaret's hands moved once, like a bird adjusting its wings. "Risk wanted a paper trail," she said. "They asked for preemptive notes in case something went wrong during the delegation. They said it was to protect the hospital. Her voice cracked. "I did not intend." "You left a man to wait," Sarah finished for her. The words tasted like metal. "You chose a bed reservation over prompt care." Margaret's eyes hardened. "You weren't following orders by orders?" Sarah's laugh was a small, sharp thing. "Orders are for saving lives. This was a business decision." Margaret's shoulders slipped as if the weight she carried had been measured in loyalty and fear. "We were told if we resisted, we would be risking funding. If the foundation pulled support, we'd lose equipment. We are short-staffed. We owe donors much of our capacity. You think we can ignore that without consequence?" The explanation did not excuse the action. It drew a clear line between her and Sarah, two kinds of loyalty, both urgent, both costly. Sarah thought of Daniel's small smile, of the way he had trusted the ward to do its work. She thought of the registrar, of Michael, of a system that had sharpened itself on the needs of those with money. Helen had warned her. The proof was now a heavier, colder thing than warning. The betrayal had a face that matched the institutional rhythm. Not evil in the dramatic sense, but a careful calculation that preferred preservation over the immediate human cost. "And Dr. Allen?" Sarah asked. "Did he know?" Margaret's eyes flicked to the plaque in the reception, as if seeing the name again repulsed her. "Yes, he arranged the visit. He said it would help the department long-term. He believed the hospital needed the funds. He didn't mean for anyone to be harmed." The words landed like a poor defense. Sarah felt a bitter clarity replace the rawness of shock. The twist was not a lie told by one person. It was a network of small choices made by people who convinced themselves they were doing right for a larger good. The larger good, Sarah now understood, wore a polished nameplate and paid in donations. She had thought the conflict was between following orders and following conscience. The new shape was worse. A system that had folded conscience into ledger entries and called it strategy. The betrayal was not just that colleagues had acted against her, it was that the institution itself had produced mechanisms to protect influence first. The war was no longer only about one patient. It was about truth against a culture that preferred neat narratives over messy human lives. The day after the prince, the hospital felt colder to Sarah, as if the building itself had taken up an attitude. She was still suspended on paper, but she moved with a strange new purpose that made the quiet streets outside feel full of meaning. Her phone filled with calls she could not answer. HR, a lawyer's assistant, a blocked number that left a message suggesting she dropped the matter. The thin thread of safety she had when she walked hospital halls was gone. In its place, a precise, sharp awareness of what could break. Daniel's condition teetered. He woke one morning and then drifted back toward the quietness that made machines cough with alarms. Margaret kept her distance now, a precise professional who avoided Sarah's gaze as if avoidance could erase participation. The registrar walked past Sarah in the corridor and spoke only to other doctors. Dr. James Allen's emails came through the internal system with an unfamiliar coolness, brief, careful, full of phrases that did not commit. He wrote about operational constraints and good governance. The words read like a shield. Michael had not been idle. He had lawyers who wore patients like armor. He called with a tone that had slipped from grief to business. He wanted records. He wanted assurances. He wanted to know who was accountable. Each request arrived with an air of litigation waiting. Sarah understood that grief could harden into control, and control could be a weapon. He defended his father the way a man defended his name. At home, Sarah's small flat felt like an evidence room. She laid out printouts, emails, the access logs Helen had found. Mark stopped by one evening to talk like they used to talk at college, practical, blunt. He brought folders and an old notebook of contacts. He said the word whistleblower without breathlessness. There are bodies that take this seriously, he said. Regulators, medical boards. Sometimes the paper will kindle a fire if fed to the right place. That option sliced the world into two routes. One route led to tribunals and hearings, to time-stretched procedures where truth is argued in sterile rooms. The other route led to the press, where stories could burst suddenly into public view and force a faster response. Both carried risk. Both could destroy careers. Both could change whether Daniel's case would be seen as an isolated incident or the symptom of a broader pattern. Sarah's choice was not abstract. She felt the weight of a man's breath in a bed she could not touch, and she watched a structure carefully arrange itself to avoid discomfort for those who gave it money. The moral shape of the choice tightened inside her like a fist. She could step forward with everything she had and risk professional ruin. A life fractured by legal battles, the possibility that the hospital would retaliate by pressing for further sanctions. Or she could do nothing and watch the story make its own way, hoping others would see what she had seen. The next morning, a nurse she had once mentored slipped her a note in the break room. "Be careful," they said, and the look on their face meant more than their words. That small relay of fear made the stakes personal. Staff were frightened. Some were brought quiet, others frightened into silence. Sarah felt suddenly very alone and very public at the same time. Helen brought another piece of the puzzle. A payroll list that showed several contracted staff paid through an outside foundation fund. The details were thin, enough to worry but not enough to prove. Helen's voice was flat as she handed over a photocopy. "Follow the money," she said. "Sometimes the trail shows motive." The trail moved toward Whitfield's foundation. The name had become a kind of gravity in the hospital. Donors had influence that bent procedures into new shapes. Margaret's earlier explanation, funding as life support for equipment and staff, had a technical honesty that did not soften the harm it had caused. Sarah understood why people in leadership would choose funding over a single messy emergency. The machines and the wards needed money. The ledger of needs gave cold logic to small cruelties. Pressure came in another form. A late-night email from HR with a list of policies Sarah had violated if she disclosed internal documents. The company lawyer's tone was legal and precise. confidentiality clauses, the risk to reputation, the possibility of injunctions. The language read like an attempt to cage action before it began. At the same time, Daniel's family pushed. Michael's calls contained a growing edge. He was angry at the world and angrier still at the idea that someone might have interfered. Sarah could feel in his voice the crystallizing of blame. If she pursued the evidence, she feared she would be blamed for the trouble that followed. People will choose a single actor to blame when systems fail. She has learned that, in other words, she felt fear not only for her job, but for who would take the fall if the truth was known. One night, unable to sleep, she opened the laptop and found another line in the log she had not noticed before. A late entry from an unknown admin account that had changed a status to non-urgent during the hour when she had been pressing neurosurgery. The timestamp matched the moment security had escorted her out. The account name was a shorthand code that would be innocuous unless someone looked closely. The raw pattern made her stomach twist. Someone had altered the flow while life teetered. That discovery escalated the danger and clarified a plan. Whoever controlled the admin privileges could shape outcomes without leaving obvious fingerprints. The hospital had built a system that allowed some users to set priorities. Those priorities carried moral weight, disguised as operational notes. Sarah realized the betrayal had its own bureaucracy, a slow machine that cleaned its margins and then asked nurses to perform the work of reasons. She took the next step that felt inevitable. Helen arranged a meeting with a journalist who had covered healthcare. The cafe felt too small for the size of what they talked about. The reporter listened without dramatics, taking notes, tasting details like someone reading a map. He asked practical things, timelines, names, proof. He did not promise a headline. He did not need to. The possibility of light existed now in the room alongside the danger of exposure. Michael learned about the meeting through a leaked internal message that made its way back to him. His reaction was quick and pointed. He wrote to the hospital's legal team, accusing Sarah of trying to manipulate records and of contacting the press. The letter assumed motives and manufactured intent. It read as both defense and preemptive strike. That night, someone keyed the tires of Sarah's old car. No note, no name, just the quiet vandalism that said someone wanted her to be afraid. The hotel of small violence promised escalation if she did not stop. Sarah held the steering wheel and felt the cold of a choice harden. She also felt a strange clarity. The pressure that threatened to crush her had stripped away the illusions. The hospital's moral architecture had been exposed in small seams. Her actions would no longer be private. They would be a test of whether an institution would accept accountability. She knew the cost. She also knew the consequence of silence. Whatever had happened to Daniel could happen again. The tension mounted toward a decision that tasted like iron. Publish now with the journalist and risk legal censure, or gather more evidence and risk the trial dissolving under administrative repair. Either move would bring heat. Either move would force a truth to announce itself. The choice was a moral crossroads, protection of a system that paid its way, or the defense of lives that did not have names on plaques. The air felt tight with the coming of something that would break or change everything. The hospital auditorium smelled of bleach and cheap upholstery, the kind of smell that reads as preparedness. Lights hung from the ceiling like small suns, their glare flattening old portraits on the walls. A crowd had gathered. Staff with tired faces, families with folded hands, a handful of reporters with notepads that flexed like small knives. The board tables sat at the front, polished enough to reflect the room's faces back at themselves. Behind it, the hospital crest gleamed, brass and unblinking. Sarah stood near the back, breath steady but thin, hands folded over the envelope that held printed emails and access logs. The empathetic voice in the narration noted the wear on her shoulders, the strain of nights counted in monitors, and the weight of a truth that had no graceful exit. The impartial observer recorded the facts. She had been suspended, she had collected evidence, she had taken her case to the press and to regulators. The room crackled with consequence. At the head of the table sat Dr. James Allen, an expression engineered into a neutral mask. Beside him, The director of development watched everyone with the precise neutrality of someone versed in donor relations. Margaret sat 2 rows in, hands clenched like small instruments. Michael Mercer occupied a front seat with lawyers arrayed behind him, face drawn into a controlled hardness. Helen and Mark kept close to Sarah, the two appearing like worn shields. The regulator's representative read from a folder, voice formal. The words were procedural, but the effect was a blade slicing a pretense. The memo about the HDU reservation, the pre-written incident script, the access logs showing priority flags, all unfolded in the clean diction of evidence. The room's temperature dropped by degrees. People shifted, discomfort made visible. Then, as if a new act had begun, the doors opened and a man entered whose presence rearranged the room's gravity. He moved with a retired general's gait, measured, upright, a presence that had been trained to command attention. General Robert Whitfield stopped at the threshold as if testing whether his name would still fit the space. Cameras turned. The empathic narrator noted how Daniel's plaque glinted like a small accusation. The impartial observer recorded that the general's foundation had donated heavily and that his visits had been scheduled weeks before. He did not take the front table. He stood instead, hands clasped, watching faces. His voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate. He spoke without evasion and with an old man's directness, the kind of speech that had both rank and a cultivated civility. "I did not come to defend practices," he said. "I came to understand. If mistakes were made, I intend to know them plainly." The admission landed differently than a lawyer's denial. It carried a weight that unmoored some assumptions. The empathetic narrator recorded the small thaw in the room. Donors could appear as shields, but donors could also be held to account when truth arrived in light. The impartial observer recorded the upcoming chain: media attention, regulator scrutiny, an internal audit, and an unraveling of premeditated scripts. The first public reading of the pre-written memo was audible as the director of development's face paled. He read the line into the microphone: "Ensure any deviation be handled as staff noncompliance." The phrase hung like iron. Murmurs rose like collected water. Margaret's hands found Sarah's across her lap, a motion born of reflex more than reconciliation. The room watched the registrar's face, Dr. Allen, loosen into a look of loss. Under pressure, small defenses cracked. Margaret's voice, previously controlled, trembled as she accounted for her actions. She spoke of fear. Fear of funding loss, fear of staff layoffs, fear that the department would lose machines that saved lives. Her confessions were jagged, incomplete, human. The empathic voice recorded the ache of compromise. How doing the right thing had been redrawn as pragmatic sacrifice. The impartial recorder noted the consequence: an admission that policy had been bent in favor of public relations at cost to a patient's timely care. Michael's lawyers rose like a defensive wall. They read pages about liability, about protective processes. Michael stood and spoke in a voice flattened by grief and the business instincts that had become his second skin. He demanded accountability, but also urged that the matter be handled without sensationalism. His words carried the logic of a man trying to hold multiple truths at once: the sorrow for a father and the fear of a legacy tarnished. Outside, the press released the first story. Headlines ricocheted and public attention spun into action. The regulator announced a formal investigation. Donations were frozen pending review. The hospital's board convened emergency sessions. The impartial observer tracked the mechanical cascade: audits, temporary suspensions of key administrators, emergency procurement to replace the shortened plasma stock. The empathic narrator watched the human cost: nights of suspense, hands that could no longer find the small steadiness of routine. In the middle of the exposure, Daniel's status shifted. The life that had been balanced on minute decisions swung toward clarity. The rapid reversal had finally been authorized after the audit's pressure and after the public light made delay costly. The operation, crude and urgent, took place with a team that moved like a single organism. Sarah watched from behind a glass, badge still removed, voice a low, steady song of hope and fear. The empathic voice described the small miracle as a measured blend of skill and lucky timing. The impartial observer recorded that the intervention succeeded enough, the bleed arrested, function restored though not whole. When Daniel opened his eyes, the room seemed to tighten around a single human fact: he was alive. The small victory was messy and incomplete. He had lost some function on his left side. His speech would require therapy, his memory held gaps like missing tiles. The human bloodline of cost, a life altered but not erased. The moral ledger shifted from irretrievable loss to a complicated rescue. Confrontations continued. Dr. Allen resigned under pressure, the director of development was placed on administrative leave, and several administrators were suspended pending the formal review. Margaret was offered a choice: dismissal or a public testimony and a pathway to restitution. She chose the latter, speaking plainly in hearings about how donors' influence had slid into administrative decisions. Her testimony was raw. It made clear the institutional pressure that reshaped priorities. The hospital changed under public scrutiny. New policies closed the seam that had allowed priority flags to override clinical need. Transparency measures were installed for donor engagements. The regulator required that HDU allocations be documented publicly and that emergency override protocols be simplified and decentralized. The impartial observer marked these as structural corrections. The empathic narrator noted that changing policy repaired some harm but could not rewind the clock. Michael's posture softened in time. He visited Daniel with a defensive edge that slowly uncoiled into a careful tenderness. He spoke to Sarah once in the corridor, words halting but real. He said, "Thank you." The phrase carried a kind of reconciliation that did not excuse earlier choices, but acknowledged the human work Sarah had done. The empathetic narrator noted the slow return of simple grace, the son who had been a lawyer and a protector finding a human foothold again. Sarah returned to the ward months later, but not as the nurse stripped of badge and name. She returned as someone whose actions had fractured a system and helped reforge it. Her badge was given back with a formal apology from the board. She accepted with a hand that held both the paper and the memory of 12 minutes. The impartial observer recorded that her career continued, that the hospital implemented training for ethical conflicts and created an anonymous reporting line for staff concerns. The empathic voice felt the survivor's quiet. She carried trauma, yes, but also a reconstituted conviction that care must not be priced or prioritized by anything but need. In the quiet afterward, Daniel and Sarah sat by a window that looked onto the river. Rain had come again, not to wash things away, but to make the small world clearer. Daniel's fingers were slower now. His smile had new lines. He turned to Sarah and said, with a voice that had been tempered by sleep and surgery and the odd mercy of being kept, "You kept watch." Sarah thought of all the small hands that had failed and the few that had not. The story did not close on tidy justice. It closed on labor. The everyday labor of people who choose, in small, stubborn acts, to hold life steady. The impartial observer recorded reforms and resignations. The empathic narrator listened to the softer, lasting notes: how truth, when forced into the light, demands messy reckonings, and how lives, when pulled back from the edge, carry both scars and a stubborn, human fidelity to continue. The ward settled into a new rhythm the way a wound settles into scar tissue, different from before, but part of the body now. Light came through the blinds in thinner stripes. Machines still hummed. People moved with tasks to do. The changes imposed by auditors and regulators had rearranged how things worked: training meetings, new checklists, a visible logbook kept. Michael sat with him in the afternoons and read oblique paragraphs from old newspapers, and sometimes they laughed at a joke that was older than both of them. The son, who had once moved like a lawyer, now moved like someone who was learning how to be small and near another person. Sarah walked the ward with hands that had learned new caution. She returned to work after the board's apology, but she carried the slow weight of what she had done and what had been done around her. People said thank you in small ways. A cup of tea left on a counter, a short nod in the corridor, a patient who asked for her when he woke. The formal awards and the investigations had a public life. The private life of caring went on as it always had, stubborn and exact. At night, she sometimes woke and replayed the 12 minutes like a short, sharp film. She could feel the flat touch of paper under her fingers, the incident report, the emailed memo, the access logs. She could feel the cold step of security walking her down the stairwell. Those things belonged to the larger fight. What settled more slowly was the moral landscape that had shifted under her feet. She had believed in a simple contract: do the work, follow the rules, save a life. The hospital had shown her that rules could be bent into armor or weapons. She wondered how many other small decisions had been reframed as necessary. Margaret came back to the floor after testifying. Her face had new tracks of strain. She did not speak with Sarah at once. They gave each other space the way people who had been through storms do, careful, measured, honest when necessary. Margaret's testimony had been a turning point. She spoke about fear and pressure and the way departments can bend toward survival. When they finally stood alone in the supply room, the conversation was not an excuse. It was a kind of accounting. "I should have said no," Margaret said quietly. "I thought I was saving the unit. I thought I could keep things together." "You did not make the plan," Sarah said, "but you tapped the screen. You were part of the chain." Margaret's hands folded. "I know. I will carry that. I will try to make it right." Attempts at repair took small forms. Margaret started leading a new ethics group on the ward, practical meetings where nurses and junior doctors could speak up without fear. She worked openly with staff to create protocols that could not be overridden by a single administrative note. It was not dramatic. It was dull, slow work, but it mattered. Dr. James Allen's resignation was sudden and public. He had been kind at times and convenient at others. He left with a statement about a lapse in judgment and institutional pressures, phrases that shielded without explaining. The director of development was moved to leave his post pending review. The hospital's board made changes to donor engagement practices. Those changes were structural and visible. They did not erase the fact that one man's fall had become a test of institutional values, but they narrowed the routes for similar harm. Sarah thought often about the general. Robert Whitfield's presence in the meetings had been quieter than she expected. He had listened more than he had defended. When he visited Daniel in recovery, he did not offer grand statements. He remembered the old soldier's way of being small and polite. "I gave money for machines," he said once to Sarah as Daniel slept. "I thought I was helping. I didn't count the cost of discretion." That admission did not solve anything, but it mattered because it acknowledged the moral gap. Wealth had made some lines thinner. Acknowledgement made them visible. It forced the board to see donors not only as benefactors, but as partners with limits. Sarah's moral reckoning came slowly, and it had many faces. There was anger, clear, hot, the kind that was wrong and demanded correction. There was grief for the time lost, for the way a man had nearly been lost, for the trust that had been compromised. There was something quieter, a recognition that institutions are made of people who balance fear and hope, who sometimes make choices with terrible reasoning. Her work had shown her that heroism was not only in the dramatic rescue, it was in the daily insistence that life be the primary ledger. She thought about whistleblowing and about public exposure. The path she chose had carried risk: vandalism, calls meant to intimidate, lawsuits threatened. It had also made changes. She had not imagined herself as the kind of person who would stand in a press room, folder in hand, describing memos and reservations. But when the choice opened in front of her, it felt less like an attempt to punish and more like an obligation to prevent. She had been a nurse long enough to know what happens when one life is considered less urgent because another table needs to be placated. There were consequences she could not unmake. Daniel carried deficits that would not vanish. The scar on his head was a thin, white line beneath his gray hair. He had fewer stories now. The fragments that remained were sharper. Michael learned to be present and to ask small questions about care. The hospital lost staff who had been part of the decisions and kept staff who pushed for repair. Some reputations were stained. Some friendships were broken. Some new alliances formed. People who had once kept silence now sat at the same table making rules. At the heart of Sarah's reflection was a simple truth. Care is moral work. It cannot be reduced to funding priorities or donor comfort. When institutions forget this, someone's life becomes the ledger on which decisions are written. That truth would guide her. She did not seek applause. She did not want to be a martyr. She wanted a daily ward where a patient's need would be louder than a plaque on a wall. Months later, in a quiet moment, she sat by the river and watched rain make temporary patterns on the water. Daniel's recovery had taught her about small victories. The hospital's reforms had taught her about structural change. Her own choice had taught her that courage is sometimes the willingness to make things harder for oneself if doing so makes things safer for others. She thought of the 12 minutes and of the long chain that had been built to protect donors. She thought of the slow work of mending policy and trust. She kept a small paper in her locker, a printout of the access log, the line that had shifted priorities. She did not keep it as a trophy. She kept it as a reminder. Rules could be written to reflect values or to hide them. She would spend the rest of her shifts making sure that in her ward, the rules matched the promise of care. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.